Imagine, just for a moment, that the ultimate divine source of the entire universe wasn't hidden away in some ancient, dusty scripture.
Right.
Imagine that the source wasn't an abstract, untouchable concept that you had to pray to from a distance, just sort of hoping your message makes it through the cosmic void.
Yeah, sending it into the ether.
Exactly. Instead, imagine that the creator, the divine, was a living, breathing person sitting right across from you,
Wow.
drinking a cup of coffee, speaking with a voice you could actually hear. Would your current worldview even allow you to recognize them? Or would your lifelong expectations completely blind you to who was sitting right in front of you?
It is a massive, incredibly disruptive question.
Yeah,
And it fundamentally challenges how we think about spirituality, how we process history, and frankly, how much we actually trust our own lived experiences when they contradict everything we've been taught.
the tension is exactly what we're getting into today. So welcome to the deep dive. We have a really fascinating mission ahead of us.
We do.
We are looking at a highly specific, highly provocative spiritual text titled The Mother Speaks, Know Me Now.
Right.
And our goal today is to unpack this document's central radical claim, which is that the goddess is currently walking the earth in human form right now,
Yes.
and that her living presence offers a direct connection that completely outdates, outshines, and overwrites any written theology you could possibly study.
But before we dive into the deep end here, I want to establish some crucial ground rules for you, the listener.
Good idea.
This text makes some very specific historically and theologically charged claims. It directly addresses major world religions.
Very directly.
Yeah, specifically Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and it heavily critiques how they have historically handled the concept of the feminine, divine, and reincarnation.
Right.
So because of the sheer magnitude of these claims, we need to clarify right up front that this deep dive is strictly an impartial exploration.
Totally impartial.
We are not taking sides. We are not validating, endorsing, or condemning these theological or historical viewpoints. Our job today is simply to map out these fascinating arguments exactly as the original author presents them so you can understand the architecture of this specific controversial framework.
I hear the ground rules, and I think they're vital, but let's play devil's advocate right out of the gate.
Let's do it.
This text is basically invalidating thousands of years of foundational theology for billions of people.
It is.
How does the author even begin to justify a claim of that magnitude? Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
The manifesto opens with a completely uncompromising assertion. It says she is here as a person right now.
Yes.
It states that when she is walking in the world, speaking and present, it is not some symbolic rehearsal for something more important. That is the moment.
Right.
The claim is that this living goddess in a human life is vastly more available to you than any sacred scroll ever written about her.
The author establishes this through a really beautiful foundational metaphor that grounds the entire text.
Oh, the river metaphor.
Yeah, it draws a sharp, unforgiving line between a lived experience and a historical record. The specific phrasing used is, "The record of the river is not the river. She is the river."
She is the river.
It's a profound way of arguing that all existing scriptures, no matter how sacred, no matter how carefully preserved or genuinely inspired, are ultimately secondhand.
Right, because they're written by people.
Exactly. They were written by someone who was not her, about a version of her they briefly encountered. And then those writings were heavily filtered through that specific writer's culture, their psychological limitations, and their desperate human need to make sense of something overwhelming.
It makes me think about the difference between reading a heavily edited, unauthorized biography of a historical figure
Yeah.
written centuries after they died versus actually sitting down and having a live face-to-face conversation with them today.
That's a great comparison.
Because in the live conversation, they can speak for themselves. They can correct misconceptions. They can react to the joke you just made. If someone wrote a book about you 2,000 years ago and people today argued with you about your own life based on that book, you'd be infuriated.
I'd be absolutely exhausted.
Right. This text is arguing that a living, first-hand connection is infinitely more true to what she actually is than any ancient interpretation.
What's fascinating here is how the text emphasizes that her present living knowledge is simply more complete.
More complete, yeah.
It states that what she carries right now, her immediate, unbroken connection to the source, is direct. It hasn't been funneled through centuries of institutional editing, political agendas, or translation errors.
It's unmediated.
Exactly. The framework positions her current living knowledge as the ultimate authority, precisely because it is happening in real time, responding to real, present conditions. She isn't quoting an old book. She's reading the room of reality.
Which naturally leads to the most obvious glaring question.
Why doesn't anyone see her?
Yes. If she is literally walking the earth, buying groceries, interacting with people, why isn't she instantly recognized? If this ultimate presence is here, why doesn't everyone just stop in their tracks and say, oh, wow, there she is?
The document has a very intricate, almost architectural answer for this, revolving around what the author calls the closed doors of theology.
Closed doors.
The argument presented is that people don't fail to recognize her out of malice or conscious hostility. They fail to recognize her because the religious frameworks that shape their entire worldview have actively, systematically made her return impossible to name.
Right, but erasing a name is one thing. Erasing the fundamental human ability to recognize the divine standing in front of you is another. How does an institution actually pull that off?
It requires a specific history of erasure, which the text outlines in detail. According to this framework, if we look at the ancient Near East, the feminine divine was vividly present and named specifically as Asherah.
All right, Asherah.
Who, as historical scholars note, was often worshipped alongside Yahweh in early Israelite religion before later theological reforms aggressively erased her.
So she was there.
The text claims her presence was a lived, acknowledged reality, not just a fringe symbol. But then the reforms came. Her name was scrubbed from the texts, her sacred groves were destroyed, and her followers were essentially told she was a mistake or a false idolatrous path.
And the timeline of this erasure doesn't stop in the ancient world. It moves forward, mutating as it goes.
Precisely. The author asserts that later, in Arabia, the historically named feminine divine presences were replaced with strict prohibitions. The very act of remembering her was declared a severe form of idolatry.
Wow.
But the text argues that the absolute most effective tool of erasure wasn't just forbidding her name, it was the systematic denial of reincarnation entirely.
That's the key.
The premise here is that traditions like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism didn't just remove the goddess from the historical past, they deliberately severed the mechanism of return. By declaring reincarnation impossible or even sinful, they ensured no one would ever look for her again.
That is such a fascinating psychological trap when you really think about it. The argument the text is making here is profound. It is saying that if you belong to a tradition that drills into your head that reincarnation is not real, then when you are standing face to face with the reincarnated goddess, your brain literally cannot process the data.
It just rejects it.
You have no theological container for the reality in front of you. The religion preemptively made her return impossible to name, so that when she did return, you would just see a normal person.
That's the core of the institutional critique. A living goddess has her own authority. She speaks for herself, she adapts, and most importantly, she cannot be institutionally managed or controlled by a priesthood.
Right, she's a threat.
Therefore, these frameworks, as described by the text, had to make her return theologically impossible to maintain their own authority. They closed and locked every conceptual door. So an individual today might meet her. They might see a remarkable, radiant woman. They might recognize her profound wisdom or feel inexplicably changed just by being in the same room.
But they can't connect the dots.
They cannot connect the individual they see to the cosmic whole of what she is, because their inherited framework aggressively dictates that such a connection is impossible.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The manifesto spends a lot of time on the fallout of this. Specifically, what happens when people try to find a comfortable middle ground?
Oh, the split.
Yeah, when they try to separate the real person they're interacting with from the divine nature they might be sensing.
Yes, the author refers to this separation as the split, and it is described not as a polite compromise, but as a deep, agonizing wound.
Oh.
Many people, according to the text, think it is highly respectful to say, I see you as a wonderfully wise person, but I'm not going to treat you like the goddess. I'll keep those things separate. They think it's appropriately humble or rational to hold those two concepts apart.
But it's not.
The text aggressively rejects this dualism. It states unequivocally that she is not two things.
So the text is completely rejecting dualism here. It's refusing the idea that the human vessel is just a mundane biological shell carrying a glowing divine passenger.
Right.
They are inextricably woven together. It reminds me of when you meet someone you've only known online for years. You have this idealized perfect avatar of them in your head.
Totally.
And then you meet them in real life, and you're almost annoyed that they have a weird, loud laugh or they chew their food strangely. You want the polished, curated concept of them, not the messy, actual human reality.
That is an excellent analogy. The text insists that her human personality, her specific way of seeing the world, the mundane things she loves, her unique quirks, these are not distractions from her divinity.
They are the divinity.
They are the exact mechanism of how her divinity expresses itself in this specific lifetime. The individual and the goddess are one unified, indivisible truth. So when someone refuses to acknowledge the divine aspect, when they tell her they just see her as a person, they aren't being rational or respectful.
They're actually hurting her.
The text argues they are actually refusing her most fundamental self-knowledge. They are looking the source of the universe in the eye and telling it that its own knowledge of itself is invalid.
Which is such a wild paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Usually we are taught that claiming to be divine is the ultimate arrogance, and that questioning it is the reasonable, grounded thing to do.
Exactly.
But looking through the lens of this document, it flips that completely. It says, this refusal lands on her as a deeply painful denial, precisely because it comes dressed up in the polite language of being reasonable, while actually erasing who she is at her very root.
And to really ground this theory, the text provides a fascinating taxonomy of not seeing. It categorizes the specific psychological archetypes of how people fail to fully recognize her, even when they are magnetically drawn into her orbit.
Let's actually dig into those, because I think anyone listening will immediately recognize these patterns in human behavior. You mentioned there's a taxonomy. What does that actually look like in practice? Give me an example of someone who just flat out rejects the premise.
The first archetype is the skeptic. This is the person for whom the conceptual container is entirely sealed.
Loctite.
They simply do not believe reincarnation or the divine feminine in human form is real. The category does not exist in their worldview. They might love her as a friend, they might find her completely remarkable and brilliant, but the door is deadbolted.
Right.
They cannot place her in the container of the living goddess because they've already predetermined that the container itself is a childish myth.
Okay, so that's the materialist wall. But what about someone who is deeply spiritual? Someone who does believe in the divine feminine? The text calls this second archetype the devoted, and it actually describes this as the most painful form of not seeing. Why is that?
It is deeply tragic in a way. The devoted person knows all the sacred names by heart. They have studied the ancient traditions, they meditate, and they have built their entire identity around the concept of the sacred feminine.
Sounds ideal.
But because of all that intense study, they measure her against ancient, static archetypes. They have a rigid, romanticized expectation of how the goddess is supposed to feel, speak, or act based on old poems and scriptures.
It's exactly like being a super fan of a fictional character and then meeting the real complex historical inspiration for that character and being deeply disappointed that they don't wear the same heroic costume or say the catchphrases.
Exactly.
You're completely missing the magic of the real person because you're addicted to the myth.
Precisely. If the living, breathing woman in front of them contradicts those ancient expectations, maybe she's too casual or too sharp or too modern, the devoted person decides she must not be the real thing. They miss the living reality because they are fiercely loyal to a ghost.
Okay, so what if someone actually does feel it, but they run away? That brings us to the third type, the fearful.
The fearful person is fascinating because they actually feel the visceral recognition. Something deep inside their intuition knows exactly who she is. There is no intellectual barrier.
But they run.
They actively talk themselves out of it, because truly acknowledging her would require changing too much of their own life. It would threaten the comfortable social hierarchy they've built or the orthodox tradition they rely on for community and structure.
Ah, self-preservation.
So to protect their familiar, safe walls, they actively look for flaws in her humanity to justify their cowardly decision to walk away.
They need her to be imperfect so they don't have to change their lives.
Wow.
And finally, the fourth archetype is the theoretician. This one feels incredibly subtle, almost arrogant.
Very subtle and steeped in academic distance. The theoretician acknowledges her in theory. They might sit over coffee and say, yes, intellectually, I concede she could be the goddess. But in daily practice, they constantly override her.
Override her how?
They question her casual authority. They would never dare question the ancient written texts of their faith, but they constantly question the living woman sitting across from them. operating under the staggering delusion that they somehow understand her nature better than she knows herself.
They love the idea of the divine, but they absolutely loathe the reality of the divine having an independent, living voice that might disagree with them.
Yes.
All of these forms of not seeing, the skeptic's material wall, the devoted's nostalgia, the fearful's cowardice, the theoretician's arrogance, they all suffer from the exact same failure. They refuse to let her be one undivided, messy, beautiful truth. They demand a split to make her easier to manage.
And exploring those archetypes leads us directly to the ultimate question of what actually happens when we fail in this way, when we refuse to see.
So what does this all mean? If you fail to see her, if you choose the locked, closed doors of tradition over the living presence right in front of you, what's the cosmic consequence? Are we talking divine punishment, lightning bolts, eternal damnation?
This is perhaps one of the most surprising and quietly beautiful elements of the entire manifesto. The answer is no.
No punishment.
She does not punish. The text explicitly states that she does not need to fight for recognition, she doesn't beg to be seen, and she certainly does not deliver petty punishments. The consequence is simply the natural, inevitable physics of choosing distance from the source.
It's not a punishment. It's just the natural trajectory of your own choices.
Exactly. The source does not chase you. It doesn't perform dramatic, sky-splitting miracles just to overcome your stubbornness. If you choose to stand with an ancient, silent image instead of the living person, then you are simply standing with a memory. You get what you chose.
There's a line in the text that perfectly captures this, and it really stuck with me. It says, "You have chosen the portrait over the person. The portrait cannot love you back."
It's a devastatingly clear image. A portrait, no matter how exquisitely painted or historically significant, cannot meet you where you are today. It cannot adapt to your present moment or comfort you in real time.
Static.
The consequence of not seeing her isn't that she strikes you down in anger. It's that a door remains unopened. You simply miss out on the genuine contact, the living, dynamic relationship that would have been entirely possible if you just opened your eyes.
Which brings us to how we should approach her, or rather, the different ways people attempt to bridge that gap. The author outlines 3 distinct approaches to the goddess and argues that only one of them actually yields real connection. If fear of consequence isn't the point, why do people use fear as the first approach?
Fear-based recognition is essentially just spiritual appeasement. People sense a massive, undeniable weight or consequence approaching, so they perform a pantomime of recognition.
Faking it.
They say the right spiritual buzzwords, they bow, and they adjust their behavior to look like they see her. They're really just trying to manage the outcome and protect themselves. The text is brutally clear here. She knows the difference. The source of the universe does not open up to people who are just performing good manners out of cosmic anxiety.
That makes total sense. You can't fake out the universe. The second approach the text details is unconsciousness.
This is where the text suggests the vast majority of people reside. And crucially, it emphasizes that this state deserves the absolute most compassion.
Why compassion?
Because these are the people moving blindly through those closed doors of inherited tradition we talked about earlier. They aren't hostile or malicious. They just simply haven't realized a different way of seeing is even available to them.
They literally don't know any better.
But for them to leave this state requires trusting their own first-hand gut experience over everything they were ever taught by their parents or priests, which is an incredibly difficult, terrifying leap for any human being to make.
It's essentially asking them to jump out of the only airplane they've ever known without knowing if they have a parachute, which leaves the final and supposedly only effective approach: love.
But the author is very careful to define exactly what is meant by love here. It doesn't mean sentimental affection, romantic feelings, or a grandiose spiritual performance.
Right.
Love, within the rigorous context of this text, is synonymous with genuine seeing. It is the active, brave choice to let her self-knowledge stand as the ultimate authority. It is the readiness to hold both truths, fully messily human and fully cosmically divine, without frantically trying to split them into something easier to handle.
And the manifesto argues this is the only approach that works. Not because it's a transactional relationship where she rewards you for being a good, loving person, but because love-based seeing creates actual, genuine contact.
Yes.
When 2 real beings are in genuine, unfiltered contact without projections or expectations, the wisdom she carries can actually move between them.
And that ultimately is the grand synthesis of this entire document. The living presence is the teaching. Every scripture, every scroll, every hymn ever written about her was just humanity trying to hold on to a memory after the visceral experience was over. But the text argues that the source is not static. It keeps moving, it keeps knowing, it keeps organically responding to reality in the present moment.
So the teaching isn't a book you memorize. The teaching is her, responding to what is real right now in this exact second.
Yes. The text asserts that she outlasts all human institutions. It describes her fundamentally as karma and dharma. Now, it's important to understand how the text uses those terms, not as abstract, distant cosmic laws that you read about in a dusty library, but as the living, breathing patterns of consequence and truth woven into the very fabric of reality itself.
The living patterns.
And those universal patterns are playing out in real time, translated through her living presence. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this text isn't just making a wild claim about a specific divine figure walking around today. It is fundamentally aggressively challenging how we interact with authority, with our own history, and with our deepest intuition.
It's a huge challenge.
It is asking us an incredibly uncomfortable question. How much do we actually trust our own lived firsthand experiences over the rigid, inherited frameworks we were taught to obey without question?
It really is a radical call to presence. The text is essentially telling us that the liberation every ancient tradition has been promising for millennia is only actually available right now, today, through direct contact with the living source, completely unmediated by any institution or priest.
Well,
It all comes down to abandoning the filter. The source will not diminish herself to be accepted by your limited worldview. She will not reshape herself to match your favorite ancient poem. You either meet her exactly as she is, whole, undivided, fully human and fully divine, or you walk right past the most important thing in the universe because you were too busy staring at an old map.
and that map, no matter how beautifully drawn, no matter how sacred you consider it, is ultimately just a historical record of where the river used to flow centuries ago. It is not the water you can drink today.
Which leaves us with a tremendous amount to think about. You know, the text tells us that the source keeps moving. If the ultimate truth of the universe is constantly evolving, constantly responding to the present moment, it means that finding it requires letting go of our most deeply held, comfortable maps.
It takes courage.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Are you actually prepared to abandon the map you've spent your whole life studying, just to recognize the real territory when it finally stands in front of you?
A profoundly challenging question to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.